Hello, everyone. If you enjoy my channel, please support me with one like, one subscribe, and one share.
The day I lost my American accent. Imagine waking up one morning, opening your mouth to speak, and hearing a stranger's voice come out. Not a different person's voice, exactly your voice, but wrong. Foreign. Off. That happened to me last spring, and I swear my heart stopped for a solid 3 seconds. I was standing in my kitchen, pouring coffee, when I said good morning to my daughter. And the words came out twisted, like my tongue had forgotten which shape to make. Not American. Not the accent I had spent 7 exhausting years perfecting. Something else. Something older. Something that sounded like home, but home was supposed to be the thing I left behind. I froze, coffee cup halfway to my lips, and I thought, what the hell just happened? You see, I had worked so hard to sound American. I practiced the R sounds until my throat ached. I watched YouTube videos on how to pronounce water like a Californian, not a confused immigrant. I repeated 33 over and over until my husband Michael told me I sounded like a robot with a speech impediment. I wanted to belong so badly that I was willing to erase every trace of where I came from, my accent, my rhythm, my musicality. And for years, it worked. People on the phone couldn't tell I wasn't born here. The cashier at Target asked me what aisle I needed. The barista guessed I was from Chicago. I felt like a spy who had finally learned the local dialect. But that morning, my American accent, my carefully constructed, painfully rehearsed, identity-changing American accent, was gone. Poof. Vanished like it had never existed. And I realized, standing there in my kitchen, that I had spent years chasing a voice that wasn't mine. I had practiced my way into someone else's mouth, and when I finally let my guard down, my real self came roaring back. My daughter looked at me, confused, and said, "Mommy, you sound different." That sentence hit me harder than any rejection I had ever faced. Because if my own child couldn't recognize my voice, who was I? What had I become? I spent the next hour in front of the mirror, trying to force my tongue back into that familiar American shape. Water. Better. Butter. Nothing worked. The words came out crisp, but wrong, like I was a tourist reading from a script. And then I did something I hadn't done in years. I let myself speak naturally. No practice. No rehearsal. Just me. And the voice that came out was warm, rich, imperfect, and undeniably mine. My husband Michael walked in and said, "That's the voice I fell in love with. Where has she been?" And I realized, right then, that I had lost my accent, but maybe, just maybe, I had found something more important. I had found my voice. But I wasn't ready to accept that yet. Not until something else happened, something that made me question everything I thought I knew about identity, language, and belonging. Not until my daughter asked me a question that I couldn't answer, no matter how many words I knew. How hard I tried to sound American. Let me tell you about the most exhausting thing I've ever done. And I promise it's not raising a child or surviving a California earthquake, it's trying to sound like someone I wasn't. For 7 years, I treated my American accent like a part-time job. I woke up every morning and practiced. Actually practiced. I would stand in the shower and repeat words like butter and water until the steam fogged up the mirror and my tongue felt like it was doing calisthenics. I watched YouTube videos on pronunciation, the kind that show you diagrams of where your tongue should be. Did you know there's a specific way to position your tongue for the American R? I didn't either, until I spent 3 weeks torturing myself in front of a bathroom mirror, contorting my mouth into shapes that felt unnatural and ridiculous. I said car and far and star so many times that Michael asked me if I was having a stroke. But I didn't care. I was obsessed. Because every time someone asked, "Where are you from?" I felt a tiny piece of myself crumble. Every time a stranger paused, tilted their head, and tried to place my accent, I felt like I had failed some invisible test. So I made a decision. I decided I would sound so American that no one would ever ask that question again. I memorized phrases that native speakers used, the ones that didn't make sense grammatically but sounded right. I'm gonna instead of I am going to. Dunno instead of I don't know. I practiced my T sounds like a maniac, softening them into the American D because real Americans say buddy or not butter. I recorded myself speaking and played it back, cringing at every syllable that didn't match. I even watched American reality TV shows just to absorb the rhythm and cadence. And slowly, painfully, it started working. My accent faded, replaced by something that sounded convincingly local. My colleagues at work stopped asking where I was from. The Uber drivers stopped making small talk about my lovely accent. I felt like a shapeshifter, and I was proud of it. I had tricked America into accepting me. I had worn the mask so well that it became my face. But here's the thing about masks, they're heavy. They're exhausting. And eventually, they crack. I remember the moment I realized I had lost myself in the process. I was on the phone with my mother back home, speaking in our native language, and I stumbled. I couldn't find the right word. My tongue had been trained so hard to think in American English that my first language was starting to feel foreign. I hung up, sat on the floor, and felt something inside me break. I had spent so much time becoming someone else that I had forgotten who I was. And the worst part? I didn't know how to come back. Not yet. But that phone call was the first crack in the mask, the first whisper of the voice I had buried so deep I forgot it existed. And then my daughter said something that shattered everything I had built. When my daughter didn't recognize my voice. You know what's more terrifying than losing your accent? Having your own child tell you they don't recognize you anymore. That happened to me the day after my kitchen breakdown. I was helping my daughter with her homework, simple math, nothing complicated, and I said, "Sweetie, you forgot to carry the one." She looked up at me with those big, confused eyes and said, "Mommy, why do you sound different? You don't sound like my mommy." I swear, time stopped. Everything went quiet except the pounding of my heart in my ears. My hands started shaking. I looked at my daughter, this beautiful little human I had created and raised and loved more than anything in the world. And I realized she didn't know who I was anymore. I had been performing a voice so perfectly that I had become a stranger to my own family. Think about that for a second. I had spent 7 years perfecting an American accent, 7 years of practicing in the shower, repeating butter and water. Mimicking reality TV stars like my life depended on it, and what did I actually achieve? I achieved invisibility. I became so good at sounding American that I erased myself. My daughter, who had heard me speak in my natural voice for the first 4 years of her life before I became obsessed with fixing my accent, couldn't remember what I used to sound like. She only knew the American version of me, the rehearsed, controlled, flattened version. And when that version slipped, when my true voice accidentally surfaced in a moment of distraction, she was confused. She didn't know who was sitting next to her. That moment shattered me in ways I didn't expect. Because it wasn't just about accents anymore. It was about identity. It was about how much of myself I had sacrificed to fit into a box that was never really mine. I wanted to belong in America, and I thought the only way to do that was to sound like I had always been here. But here's the irony that hit me like a freight train. I was so busy trying to sound like a native that I never actually felt like one. All those years of practicing, all those hours of rehearsal, and I still felt like a fraud. Because you can't fake belonging. You can't practice your way into a community. Belonging isn't about sounding right, it's about showing up, being seen, and letting yourself be known. And I had been hiding behind an accent the whole time. I was so desperate to be invisible that I made myself unrecognizable to the people who loved me most. My daughter was 7 years old, and she had no idea what her mother's real voice sounded like. That's not belonging. That's erasure. And I had done it to myself. I sat on the floor, pulled her onto my lap, and whispered in my real voice, the one I had been hiding for so long, "Sweetie. This is how Mommy really talks. I'm sorry I forgot." She hugged me and said, "I like this voice better. It sounds like you." And I realized, right then, that I had been trying so hard to be someone else that I had forgotten that the most important people in my life loved me exactly as I was. They didn't need me to sound American. They needed me to sound like me. But I still wasn't ready to fully embrace that. Because the biggest challenge was still ahead of me, a challenge that involved Michael, a conversation I had been avoiding for years. And a truth I was terrified to admit out loud. The man who loved my real voice. Here's something I never expected to admit. My husband Michael had been silently mourning my real voice for years. I found out one evening when I came home from work, exhausted, and collapsed on the couch. I was too tired to perform. Too tired to rehearse. Too tired to remember which shape my tongue was supposed to make. So I just spoke. Naturally. Imperfectly. Honestly. And Michael looked up from his book and smiled. Not his usual smile, something softer, something almost relieved. He said, "There she is. I was wondering when you'd come back." I stared at him, completely confused. "What are you talking about?" And then he told me something that broke my heart and healed it at the same time. He said, "I've missed your voice. The real one. The one I fell in love with in that coffee shop. You know, when we first met, you didn't sound American at all. You sounded like you, warm, musical, a little uncertain, completely beautiful. And then somewhere along the way, you started changing. You flattened everything. You worked so hard to sound like everyone else that you stopped sounding like yourself. I didn't say anything because I thought it was what you wanted. I sat there, completely stunned. 7 years. 7 years of practicing, rehearsing, perfecting. And my husband, the person who knew me best in the entire world, had been silently waiting for me to come back to myself. He never asked me to sound American. He never corrected my pronunciation. He never commented on my accent, not even once. Because he didn't care about how I sounded. He cared about who I was. And the cruelest irony of all was that I had been trying to sound American for a man who loved me exactly as I was. I thought I needed to fit in. I thought I needed to erase my foreignness to be worthy of love. But the only person who had ever truly seen me, the only person who had ever loved me without conditions, loved the accent I had been so desperately trying to bury. I started crying, because that's apparently my default emotional state now, and Michael just held me and said, "Stop trying to be someone else. You're already exactly who I want." And in that moment, something shifted inside me. I realized that belonging doesn't come from sounding like everyone else. It comes from being seen and loved anyway. It comes from the audacity to show up as yourself and trust that you are enough. I spent 7 years trying to be invisible, and the man I married spent 7 years waiting for me to be visible again. That is the most humbling thing I have ever experienced. And I decided, right then, that I was done performing. I was done with the American accent. I was done with the rehearsed sentences and the flattened vowels. I was going to sound like me again, even if the whole world asked, "Where are you from?" for the rest of my life. It was terrifying. It was liberating. And it was the hardest decision I ever made. But I had no idea how much harder it would get before it got easier. The first time I spoke without apologizing. Let me tell you about the most terrifying moment of my entire life, and it didn't involve a job interview, a medical emergency, or even a confrontation. It involved a grocery store cashier. Specifically, it involved me walking into a Ralph's in Pasadena, picking up a carton of milk, and walking to the checkout counter where a young woman with purple hair and an extremely bored expression asked me, "How are you doing today?" And for the first time in 7 years, I didn't rehearse my answer. I didn't flatten my vowels. I didn't force my tongue into that familiar American shape. I just opened my mouth and let the words come out exactly as they wanted to. "I'm doing okay, thank you. How about you?" And it was the most imperfect, un-American, utterly foreign sentence that had ever left my lips in this country. My accent was thick. My R sounds rolled slightly. My A sounded like it belonged somewhere across an ocean. And I didn't apologize. I didn't cringe. I didn't rush to correct myself or repeat the sentence with better pronunciation. I just stood there, holding my milk, waiting for her reaction. She smiled, a real smile, not the fake one cashiers give when they're just being polite, and said, "I love your accent. Where are you from?" And I didn't feel that familiar stab of shame. I didn't feel the urge to say California and change the subject. I said, "I'm from somewhere far away, but I've been here for a while now." And she said, "That's so cool. Your voice sounds like music." I almost dropped my milk. For 7 years, I had been trying to sound American so people wouldn't notice me. And the first time I let myself sound like me, a complete stranger called my voice musical. She didn't hear a foreigner. She didn't hear someone who didn't belong. She heard something beautiful. And I realized, standing there in that checkout line with a carton of milk and a stunned expression, that I had been wrong about everything. I had been so afraid of being different that I had erased the one thing that made me unique. My accent wasn't a weakness. It wasn't a barrier. It was a signature. It was proof that I had lived, that I had traveled, that I had crossed oceans and built a life somewhere new. And the people who mattered, the cashier, my husband, my daughter, they didn't want me to be less. They wanted me to be more. I walked out of that store feeling like I had just run a marathon. My heart was pounding, my hands were sweating, and I had the biggest, dumbest smile on my face. I had done something I never thought I could do. I had spoken English without apologizing for who I was. I had let myself be seen. I had let myself be heard. And the world didn't end. The cashier didn't laugh. The other customers didn't stare. Nothing happened except me realizing that I had been the only one judging myself all along. But the relief I felt in that moment was quickly followed by something else, a sudden wave of grief for all the years I had wasted. All the years I had hidden. All the years I had been afraid. And that grief led me to a conversation I had been avoiding for even longer than my accent. A conversation that would finally, completely, and forever change how I saw myself. My voice on the phone with my mother. The conversation I had been avoiding for years wasn't with Michael or my daughter or even myself, it was with my mother, 8,000 miles away. On the other side of an ocean. I had called her every Sunday for 7 years, but every single call had been a performance. I would flatten my accent, speak in careful, controlled English, and pretend that everything was fine. I never told her how hard I was trying. I never told her that I was erasing myself. I never told her that I had lost my voice. But after the grocery store encounter, after the cashier called my voice musical, I knew I couldn't keep hiding anymore. So I called her on a Tuesday, not a Sunday, because I didn't want to give myself time to prepare. I wanted to be caught off guard. I wanted to speak without rehearsal. She answered on the second ring, and I heard her voice, warm, familiar, full of the music I had grown up with. And I opened my mouth and spoke in my natural voice. Not flattened. Not rehearsed. Just me. My accent was thick. My vowels were round. My rhythm was a little off. And I said, "Mom, I need to tell you something." She was quiet for a moment, and then she said something that made my heart stop. She said, "My daughter, I haven't heard you sound like this in years. I thought you had forgotten who you were." And I started crying, ugly crying, the kind that makes your voice crack and your nose run, because my mother had known. She had always known. She had heard me changing, year after year, call after call, and she had never said anything because she didn't want to make me feel bad. She had been silently mourning the loss of my voice for 7 years, just like Michael had. I spent the next hour telling her everything about the accent, the rehearsals, the shame, the grocery store, the cashier who called my voice musical. And when I finished, she said, "You never needed to change. I gave you that voice. It was already perfect." That sentence hit me harder than anything I had ever heard. My mother had given me my voice, my accent, my rhythm, my musicality. All the things I had been trying to erase were the things she had given me out of love. And by rejecting them, I had been rejecting her. I hung up the phone and sat on the floor, completely overwhelmed. I had spent 7 years running away from myself, and everyone I loved had been waiting for me to come back. My husband, my daughter, my mother. They all wanted the same thing, the real me, the imperfect me, the me who sounded like she had crossed an ocean to find a new home. And I finally understood that my voice wasn't a barrier. It was a gift. It was proof that I came from somewhere, that I had a history, that I was more than just a collection of rehearsed phrases. But the hardest part was still coming. Because now I had to figure out how to live in this new reality. How to speak without apologizing. How to show up as myself. And that meant walking into the world every single day and letting people hear who I really was. It was terrifying. It was necessary. And it changed everything. My accent at work, the surprising reaction. The next morning, I walked into my office with a decision I had made the night before. I was going to speak in my natural voice for an entire day. No rehearsing. No flattening. No pretending to be someone I wasn't. Just me. I walked past the receptionist, and instead of my usual carefully practiced, "Good morning, how are you?" I said it the way it naturally came out. My accent was thick. My vowels were round. I sounded like someone who had grown up in a different country, because I had. And I waited for the judgment that I had been dreading for 7 years. But it never came. My colleague Sarah, who had worked next to me for 3 years, looked up from her computer and said, "Wow. I've never heard you speak like that before. It's so much warmer. I love it." I blinked at her, completely stunned. "You're not making fun of me?" She laughed. "Why would I make fun of you? You sound like you have a story to tell. It makes you interesting." That was the moment I realized something I had never understood. My accent wasn't a weakness. It was a strength. It was a conversation starter, a point of connection, a reminder that the world is bigger than one country, one culture, one way of speaking. I walked into a meeting that afternoon and presented my project in my natural voice. I didn't apologize for my pronunciation. I didn't slow down to flatten my vowels. I just spoke. And after the meeting, my boss pulled me aside and said, "I don't know what changed, but you seem so much more confident. Whatever you're doing, keep doing it." I wanted to laugh out loud. For 7 years, I had been hiding myself, thinking that my accent made me less competent. But the moment I stopped hiding, the moment I let myself be seen, everyone around me responded with warmth and appreciation. No one had ever asked me to sound American. No one had ever told me my accent was a problem. I was the only one who had been judging myself. I spent the rest of that day floating on a cloud of relief. I had spent years terrified of being rejected because of my accent, and not a single person in my entire life had ever rejected me. My boss, my colleagues, my husband, my daughter, my mother, they all preferred the real me over the fake one. And I realized that I had been holding myself back for no reason. My accent wasn't a barrier to belonging. It was proof that I belonged. Because belonging isn't about being the same as everyone else. It's about being accepted as you are. And everyone in my life had already accepted me. I was the only one who hadn't accepted myself. But I still had one more challenge ahead of me. One more situation where I had always felt the most pressure to sound American. One more test that I was terrified to face. And it would come from the most unexpected place imaginable, my daughter's school, at a parent-teacher conference. In a room full of strangers who didn't know my story. My voice at my daughter's school. You know what's more terrifying than speaking your natural accent at work? Speaking your natural accent in a room full of strangers who don't know your story. And that's exactly where I found myself a week later, sitting in my daughter's classroom, surrounded by 20 other parents. Waiting for the parent-teacher conference to begin. My heart was pounding so loudly I was sure the woman next to me could hear it. I had been to these conferences before, of course. But every single time, I had performed. I had flattened my accent, rehearsed my sentences, and pretended to be someone I wasn't. I had been so good at pretending that none of these parents had ever heard my real voice. But I had made a promise to myself, and I wasn't going to break it. So when the teacher called my name and asked how I thought my daughter was doing, I didn't rehearse. I didn't flatten. I just opened my mouth and spoke in my natural voice. She's doing wonderfully, I said, and my accent was thick, my vowels round, my rhythm completely different from the careful, flattened voice I had used for years. And I waited for the judgment. The stares. The confusion. The moment when someone would ask, "Where are you from?" and I would feel that familiar stab of shame. But none of that happened. Instead, the teacher smiled warmly and said, "She's a wonderful student. And I can tell she gets her warmth from you." I blinked at her, completely stunned. I was so used to hearing my accent as a problem that I had forgotten it could be heard as something else, something positive, something human. Another parent leaned over and said, "Your accent is beautiful. Where are you from?" And for the first time in my life, I didn't feel that urge to change the subject. I didn't feel that hot flush of shame crawling up my neck. I just said, "I'm from a different country, but I've been here for a while now." I guess my accent never quite left. She smiled and said, "That's amazing. You should never lose it. It makes you interesting." I walked out of that conference feeling like I had just conquered Mount Everest. My heart was still pounding, my hands were still shaking, but I had done it. I had shown up as myself, in a room full of strangers, without apologizing for who I was. And the world didn't end. The parents didn't judge me. The teacher didn't treat me differently. I had spent years terrified of being seen, and the moment I let myself be seen, everyone responded with warmth and curiosity. That's when I realized the most important lesson of my entire life. People don't reject authenticity. They crave it. They're exhausted by performances too. Everyone in that room was pretending something. Everyone was wearing some kind of mask. And by taking mine off, I gave them permission to take off theirs. But the biggest surprise was still to come. Because as I was walking out of the school, my daughter ran up to me, hugged my legs, and said something that made my entire body freeze. She said, "Mommy, I heard you talking to my teacher. You sounded just like you. I'm so proud of you." A 7-year-old was proud of me for being myself. And that was the moment I understood, belonging isn't something you earn by pretending. It's something you receive by being real. And I had finally, completely, utterly understood that. The day I finally spoke my truth. I want to tell you about the most terrifying moment of my entire journey, and it didn't happen in a grocery store, a coffee shop, or even my daughter's school. It happened in my own living room, in front of a camera, recording a video I never thought I would have the courage to make. You see, after all those breakthroughs, the grocery store cashier, my mother's phone call, my daughter's teacher, Michael's confession, I still had one fear left. One fear that had been lurking in the shadows of my mind since the day I lost my American accent. The fear that if I stopped performing, if I stopped trying to sound American, I would lose the identity I had worked so hard to build. I was terrified that without the accent, I would become invisible again. That people would see me as foreign, as other, as someone who didn't belong. I had spent years hiding behind a voice that wasn't mine, and I was scared that if I let it go, I would lose my place in this country. So I decided to do something radical. I decided to record myself speaking in my natural voice. No filters. No rehearsals. No editing. Just me, sitting in my living room, talking about my story. I set up my phone, pressed record, and started talking. And the first time I watched it back, I cringed. My accent was so thick. My voice cracked in all the wrong places. My pronunciation was so obviously foreign. I nearly deleted the video 10 times. But something stopped me. Something made me watch it again. And again. And again. And on the 4th time, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. I wasn't hiding. I wasn't performing. I was showing up. I was being real. And there was something powerful about that, something that felt more authentic than any perfectly rehearsed sentence I had ever spoken. I posted that video to a small online community of English learners, and I waited for the judgment. I braced myself for the comments about my accent, about my pronunciation, about all the ways I didn't sound American. But the comments that came in were completely unexpected. They said things like, "I've never heard anyone speak so honestly before." Your voice makes me feel less alone. I've been hiding my accent too, and you just gave me permission to be myself. I sat there, scrolling through those comments, and I started crying, not sad tears, not overwhelmed tears, but the kind of tears that come when you realize you've been carrying a weight for so long that you forgot it was even there. And in that moment, I finally let it go. I let go of the shame. I let go of the fear. I let go of the desperate need to sound like everyone else. I realized that my voice wasn't a weakness. It was a gift. It was proof that I had lived, that I had loved, that I had crossed oceans and built a life somewhere new. It was the sound of survival, of courage, of home. And I knew, in that moment, that I was finally free. But the journey wasn't over yet. Because I had one more person to talk to, one more conversation that would seal everything I had learned. A conversation with a stranger who would ask me the question I had been avoiding my whole life. And the answer would change everything. I found my voice and it sounds like home. Here's the thing about finding your voice, it doesn't happen in one dramatic moment. It happens in 1,000 small moments, each one peeling away another layer of fear until all that's left is you. And that's exactly what happened to me. The stranger who asked me the question I had been avoiding my whole life was a woman at a park bench, sitting next to me while our daughters played on the swings. She was from somewhere else too. I could hear it in her accent, in the way she chose her words carefully, in the slight hesitation before she spoke. And she looked at me and asked, "Do you ever feel like you don't belong here? Like no matter how long you stay, you'll always be a visitor?" I could have given her the easy answer. I could have said something polite and moved on. But I didn't. Instead, I looked at her, and I said, "I used to." For years, I felt exactly like that. I tried so hard to sound American that I forgot who I was. I practiced my accent until my tongue hurt. I memorized phrases I didn't even understand. And I still felt like a fraud. She nodded, and I could see the recognition in her eyes. She knew exactly what I was talking about. But then something changed, I continued. I realized that belonging isn't about sounding like everyone else. It's about showing up as yourself and trusting that there's room for you. It's about understanding that your accent isn't a weakness, it's a story. It's proof that you lived somewhere else, loved somewhere else, and still found the courage to start over. She looked at me with tears in her eyes, and she said, "How did you learn to believe that?" I smiled, and I told her the truth. I stopped trying to be someone else. I stopped rehearsing my sentences. I stopped flattening my vowels and apologizing for my pronunciation. And when I did, the people who mattered didn't run away. They came closer. They said, "Finally, there you are." And I realized that I had been the only one rejecting myself all along. She hugged me, right there on that park bench, and I felt something shift inside me. I had done it. I had finally, completely, utterly accepted myself. I had lost my American accent, and I had found my voice. Not the voice I rehearsed in the shower. Not the voice I practiced in front of the mirror. My voice. The one my mother gave me. The one my husband fell in love with. The one my daughter recognized as home. And I knew, in that moment, that I would never hide it again. Because hiding myself was never the answer. Belonging was never about sounding American. It was about sounding like me. And I finally sounded like me. I finally felt like me. I finally was me. That's all for today. I'll make more similar videos in the future. Don't forget to subscribe to see them.